18 years is long enough to stop being afraid of the dark. I want to establish that first, because it matters to everything that follows. The dark in a cave is a specific and complete thing, not the dark of a room with the lights off, where photons still filter under the door or around the curtain edge, and your eyes find something to work with. Cave dark is the absence of light in its most total form, the darkness that existed before fire, and the first dozen times you kill your light underground, the instinctive response is a kind of low-level panic that most people work through and a few don't. I worked through it early. 20 years ago, when I was still doing guided trips in commercial caves and learning the technical side of wild caving on weekends. By the time I was doing serious solo work in the Blue Ridge systems, I'd reached the point where darkness was simply a neutral condition, like cold water or thin passage, something to be managed rather than feared. What happened east of Fancy Gap changed that relationship. Not completely and not permanently in the way that would have ended my caving. But there's a difference now between how I experience cave dark and how I experienced it before that day. A faint additional weight to the absence of light that wasn't there before, and I think honesty requires me to acknowledge that before I describe what caused it. The system I was working was one I'd found the previous spring, an entrance in a limestone outcrop about a mile off a fire road in the ridge country east of the Parkway. I'd made 2 previous trips, the first to assess the entrance series and the second to push the primary passage as far as a breakdown section that I hadn't fully navigated. The breakdown room was the goal for this third trip, a room-sized accumulation of collapsed ceiling material that required careful route finding, but that I'd scoped on my second visit and thought I could get through to. Reach what the acoustics suggested was a larger chamber. Beyond. I went in alone, which I do regularly, and which involves specific protocols around timeline, check-in contacts, and entrance marking that I'm not going to detail here, except to say that I take them seriously. Solo caving has risks that partnered caving doesn't, and managing those risks is a matter of discipline and preparation rather than luck. I'd been caving solo in Blue Ridge systems for 11 years at that point, and had encountered nothing I couldn't handle. I mention this because I want to be clear that my assessment of the situation that day was not the product of inexperience or poor preparation. The entrance series took about 15 minutes at the pace I was moving, a moderately tall walking passage that dropped into a hands and knees crawl for about 30 feet before opening into the first notable space in the system, a room I'd named the landing in my notes, roughly 20 feet across with a ceiling that allowed standing. From the landing, the primary passage continued as a traverse passage, wide but low, that required a kind of sideways duck walk for most of its length before breaking into the breakdown room. The breakdown room itself took another 15 minutes to navigate the collapsed material, required testing each piece before committing weight, moving deliberately across rubble that had been settling for however long this section of the ceiling had been down, which the moss and flowstone on some of the blocks suggested was a substantial length of time. I crossed to the far side of the breakdown and found the passage I'd scoped on my prior visit, a narrow horizontal slot, about 18 inches high and perhaps 3 feet wide, running into the hillside at a slight downward angle. This is the passage I'm going to describe carefully because the geometry of it matters. The slot was a belly crawl, the kind where you lie flat, turn your helmet to its lowest profile, and move by pushing with your feet and pulling with your forearms in a specific sequence. It was not exceptionally tight by the standards of the caves I'd worked, but it was tight enough that once you were in, there was no quick exit, no way to flip or turn, only forward or backward. The floor of the slot was breakdown material, flat slabs of limestone, some solid and some that shifted slightly when you moved over them, the gaps between them dark and variable. The ceiling was solid and low. I was about 40 minutes into the total trip when I'd worked my way into this passage about 20 feet in from the breakdown room. Moving well, no problems. The passage doing what passages do, occasionally widening, occasionally tightening, the floor surface changing from slab to gravel and back. I was focused on the forward problem, reading the passage ahead with my headlamp for the next 3 or 4 body lengths and planning the movement accordingly. I heard the breathing when I stopped to reassess a floor section that had a hollow sound to it. I was lying still, which is when you hear things you don't hear when you're moving, and the sound was there the moment I stopped, as if it had been there all along and my movement had been covering it. Nasal breathing, slow, coming from below me, from beneath the floor slab I was lying on, through the gap between that slab and the one ahead of it. I'll be honest about the first few seconds, which were the seconds before I'd fully identified what I was hearing. In those seconds, my brain was still doing its categorizing work, running through the list of sounds that caves produce: water in distant passages, taking on a rhythmic quality, air movement through tight openings, the acoustic effects of certain chamber shapes. I gave it those few seconds to find an explanation from the available list. It didn't find one. What I was hearing didn't fit any of those categories. It had the variability of biological respiration, the slight differences between inhale and exhale, the small irregularities that distinguish breathing from any mechanical sound. I killed my light. This is what you do when you want to hear clearly in a cave. You eliminate the noise of your own visual processing, the small muscular adjustments of watching, and you reduce yourself to pure listening. In the dark, I lay still, and I listened, and the breathing continued, slow and deep, each cycle taking somewhere around 6 seconds, the kind of respiratory rate that belongs to something large at rest. Not labored, not excited. Simply breathing in the patient way of something that has been in one place for a long time and has no intention of changing that. I held my own breath and listened. The rhythm didn't change. I breathed out slowly and the rhythm didn't change. I moved my forearms slightly on the slab floor, a small deliberate sound, and the rhythm didn't change. Whatever was beneath that floor had not been startled by my presence and was not responding to my attempts to provoke a response. It was simply there, breathing, in a space beneath the floor of the passage I was in the dark of a cave system that I had mapped as uninhabited. I started doing the math. Not emotional math, practical math, the kind that keeps you functional when the situation wants you to be otherwise. I was approximately 20 feet into the slot passage, which meant 20 feet of belly crawl between me and the breakdown room, then the breakdown crossing, then the traverse passage and the landing and the entrance series. 45 minutes to an hour of careful movement, minimum. There was nothing I could do about that timeline, except begin it. I began it in the dark, which I'd never done in a tight passage before. I made that choice deliberately because turning my light back on felt like a declaration that I couldn't fully reason, through a declaration of presence to whatever was beneath me, though I acknowledged that I had no evidence it didn't already know I was there. The dark felt safer. I moved backward by feel, pushing with my hands and pulling with my feet in the reverse sequence, the slab floor cold against my chest and forearms. The breathing continued as I moved. I tracked it as I retreated, and what I can tell you is that it did not follow me. The sound stayed consistent, same depth, same rhythm, same approximate location beneath the floor slab where I'd first heard it. It didn't speed up when I moved, didn't change in any way that suggested awareness of my retreat. It just continued, steady and unbothered, the breathing of something that had been there before I arrived and would be there after I was gone. I made it back through the breakdown room and through the traverse, and through the landing and through the entrance crawl, and out into the late afternoon light of the Blue Ridge, in considerably less time than I'd taken to go. I sat outside the entrance for a while. The air outside smelled like October decaying leaves and cold stone, and the particular quality of mountain air in that season. I was aware of it in a way that I'm not usually aware of outside air when I come out of a cave. The contrast. I've been back to the outcrop twice since. Both times I've stood at the entrance and looked in and not gone further. Not because I'm unable to, I've been in tighter situations in worse caves and come out fine. Because of what the breathing didn't do. Because it didn't change when I moved. Because the complete absence of response was more disturbing to me than any response would have been. Something that doesn't react to you has made an assessment. It has decided what you are and what you're worth, and it has continued doing whatever it was doing before you arrived. I don't know what was in the space below that floor slab. I don't know how large the space was, or what it would take to access it, or what was using it, and for what purpose. The breakdown in that section. The siphon is the reason most people don't go past the fourth chamber. I want to explain what a siphon is for people who haven't caved, because the word doesn't fully convey the reality. A siphon is a section of cave passage that is completely filled with water ceiling to floor, wall to wall, no airspace. To pass through one, you go underwater, in the dark, in a constricted space, and you swim or pull yourself along the passage until you emerge on the other side into air again. The distance of this underwater section determines everything about whether a siphon is passable. A 3-foot siphon in a wide passage is an inconvenience. A 20-foot siphon in a tight passage is a serious technical challenge that requires training, proper equipment, and the specific psychological makeup that allows you to commit to moving through an airless, submerged rock tube with no guarantee of what's on the other side. The siphon off the 4th chamber at milepost 217 is not extreme by the standards of cave diving, but it's not trivial either. The pool that feeds it sits at the back of the 4th chamber, a still black oval of water about 8 feet across, cold at 52 degrees, the bottom sloping away into the passage that the siphon runs through. I'd looked at that pool on my first significant visit to the system, and had gotten into the water to probe the passage and found it running deeper and tighter than the entry suggested, which is common with siphons. What you see from the surface often misrepresents the actual geometry. I'd come back out and noted the location in my survey and set it aside. The second attempt was 6 months later, after I'd done 2 practice dives in a flooded quarry to work on my comfort with confined underwater spaces. I had a small waterproof light clipped to my wrist and a thin guideline that I anchored to a projection in the 4th chamber wall and carried with me into the water as a return reference. The siphon ran tight for about 12 feet. I could feel the ceiling inches above my back and the floor inches below me as I pulled myself along the line, and then it opened abruptly into a wider space, and I felt the ceiling lift away and my head came up into air. I've been in a lot of caves. I've had a lot of first moments in new spaces, that specific experience of being the first person, or one of the first, to see a particular room with light. What I surfaced into on the other side of that siphon had the quality of all those moments, amplified. The ceiling was vaulted, maybe 15 feet at the apex. The formation work on it dense and intact in the way of a room that's seen no human traffic and no vandalism. The floor was dry sand, level and smooth, the kind of aeolian deposit that accumulates in caves over very long periods. The room was roughly the size of a large living room, perhaps 20 feet by 30, with 2 narrow passages leading off the far end that I noted for future investigation. I came out of the siphon pool and stood on the sand floor and let my light travel around the space, taking inventory. The formations were excellent. I could see a curtain of aragonite on the far wall and several stalactites that had grown long enough to meet their corresponding stalagmites into columns. The air had the quality of still cave air, cool and slightly humid, no detectable movement. The temperature on my wrist thermometer read 54 degrees, consistent with the system's ambient temperature. I was doing my initial scan when I noticed the depression. It was in the center of the room, roughly, a circular depression in the sand floor, perhaps 5 feet across, bowl-shaped. The sand within it compacted and worn smooth in the way that surfaces become smooth under repeated contact. The edges of the depression had a specific character, not sharp, not recent, but not ancient either. The kind of edge definition you see in surfaces that have been worked repeatedly over a medium-length period, months to years rather than decades or centuries. I crouched at the edge of it and looked at the surface. The sand within the depression had been compressed significantly, the grains packed more tightly than the surrounding floor, which is consistent with sustained weight over time. The depression was deeper at the center, maybe 8 or 9 inches at the lowest point, and shallower toward the edges, which is the profile you get when something with a relatively consistent mass and shape occupies the same space repeatedly. I held my hand over the center of the depression without touching it. Immediately, I felt warmth. In a cave where the ambient temperature is 54 degrees year-round, where the rock and sand hold that temperature with the thermal consistency of the earth itself, the depression was radiating warmth. Not dramatically, not the warmth of something present and alive in the room with me, which would have been a different kind of moment. The warmth of residual biological heat in a confined space. The warmth that remains in a surface after something warm has occupied it and recently left. I stayed crouched at the edge of that depression for a period of time I didn't measure. I was processing what the warmth meant. Something with a body temperature significantly above 54 degrees had been in that depression recently enough that the heat had not yet fully dissipated into the surrounding sand. Cave sand is an excellent thermal insulator. Heat dissipates slowly, But even accounting for that, the temperature differential I was feeling required a relatively recent departure. Hours, possibly. Not days. I stood and moved my light to the walls. The limestone walls of the chamber had been marked. I want to be precise about the nature of the marks because the distinction between tool marks and pressure marks is significant. Tool marks made by a sharp or hard object leave a characteristic texture, a roughness or groove pattern that is distinct under light. What I saw on these walls was different. The limestone had been rubbed smooth in horizontal bands, the surface polished by repeated contact in the specific way that stone polishes when something soft and warm passes over it many times. The bands were at a consistent height, roughly 2.5 to 3 feet above the floor, and they ran along 3 of the 4 walls, interrupted only by the passages at the far end and the siphon pool at the entrance end. The height is what stayed with me. 2.5 to 3 feet is shoulder height for something that is moving low, on all fours or in a crawling position, pressing its body against the wall as it moves. Something that navigates this room in contact with the walls, regularly enough to have polished them over an extended period. Something that is not upright. I moved to the siphon pool end of the chamber and looked at the floor between the pool and the depression. The sand there showed a clear, worn path, the kind of path that forms when traffic between 2 points is regular enough, over long enough that the surface compresses and the grains align. The path ran straight between the siphon pool and the depression. Whatever used this chamber arrived through the water, moved to the depression, occupied it, and returned through the water. That was the pattern. Consistent, repeated, habitual. I spent perhaps 20 minutes in the chamber, photographing everything, and taking notes with hands that I noticed were not entirely steady. The formations, the depression, the wall markings, the path. I tried to construct the profile of what the evidence described, something large enough to create a 5-foot depression with consistent mass. Something that navigates water without distress, entering and leaving through a siphon that I had found challenging with preparation and equipment. Something that moves in contact with the walls at a height, suggesting a non-upright posture. Something that occupies a specific location with enough regularity to have worn both the floor and the walls in distinctive ways. Something that had been here recently enough to leave warmth in the sand. I came back through the siphon with my guideline and my wrist light, and I came up in the siphon pool in the 4th chamber, and I sat on the bank for a few minutes. The 4th chamber was, as I'd left it, empty and ordinary, the survey markers I'd placed on prior trips undisturbed. I took out my field notebook and wrote a single line. Chamber 5 accessed. Evidence of occupation. Source unknown. Then I closed the notebook and put it in the dry bag and prepared for the exit. I've thought many times about who or what navigates that siphon, about what can hold its breath for the 12 feet of tight underwater passage and emerge into Chamber 5 and use it the way the evidence suggests it's been used. I've thought about the dimensions of the siphon and what could move through it comfortably, because the tightness I experienced on my human body, going through with a minimal equipment profile, gave me a clear sense of what the constraints were. Something significantly smaller than a human, or something whose body is shaped differently, or something whose comfort with confined underwater spaces is far greater than mine. I've also thought about the warmth, about what it means that whatever left that heat in the depression was there recently enough that the heat hadn't dissipated when I arrived, about what it means that I emerged from the siphon pool and spent 20 minutes in that chamber and saw nothing, no movement, no indication of a presence other than the evidence on the floor and walls, about where it was during those 20 minutes. The passages off the far end of the chamber. I noted them for future investigation on the way in, and I walked past them on my survey without entering them because they were too narrow for a direct assessment without committing to a tight crawl. 2 narrow passages, dark, running deeper into the hill. I put my light to each one briefly and saw nothing but passage extending into the dark. I've been back to the 4th chamber 4 times since. Each time I've looked at the siphon pool and decided against re-entry. Not because of fear exactly, though. I'm aware that fear is part of the calculation, and I'm choosing to be honest about that. Because of what the evidence implies about the thing that uses Chamber 5, and specifically about the timing of my visit relative to its presence, and specifically about where it might have been while I was in there, with my light doing my survey, and specifically about whether it understood what I was. My notes are sealed in a locked drawer. The coordinates are not shared. The survey is listed as incomplete, which it is, because I have not entered the 2 passages at the far end of the chamber and I do not intend to. I've started thinking about the depression differently than I did when I first found it. When I found it, I thought about it as a resting place. The way an animal makes a bed, something functional, a place to sleep or shelter. But the warmth and the regularity of use that the wear pattern implies, and the path between the pool and the depression, all of that suggests a place that is. Marcus has been my closest friend for going on 20 years, and in that time I've watched him handle things that would have undone most people. He's steady in the way that certain people are steady, not because he's incapable of fear, but because he processes it differently, metabolizes it into focus rather than paralysis. I've seen him manage a vehicle off an icy road at 60 miles an hour with the calm of someone parking in an empty lot. I've seen him talk a situation down that most people would have let escalate into something serious. He's the person I'd want beside me in any circumstances that required someone not to come apart. I tell you this because what happened to Marcus in the Flat Rock cave system, that October changed something in him that I haven't seen change back. And I want you to understand that whatever it was he encountered in that squeeze section, it was enough to alter a person I'd considered genuinely unalterable. My wife Nora and I had been in the Flat Rock system twice before that trip. It's a moderately technical cave in the Blue Ridge, accessible on public land, well documented in the regional caving literature, the kind of system that experienced recreational cavers used to push their skills without committing to the more serious challenges of undeveloped wild caves. The primary passage is navigable for most of its length, with basic equipment and reasonable fitness. There are a few sections that require specific technique, including a squeeze about 300 feet in from the entrance that narrows the passage to a body-width slot for about 8 feet before opening back up. Nothing extreme. A challenge for beginners, a routine obstacle for anyone who'd done moderate technical caving. We'd invited Marcus and his partner Celia because they'd been asking to come with us for a couple of years, and the Flat Rock system was the right introduction, interesting enough to justify the trip, manageable enough that we wouldn't be putting anyone in over their head. Marcus had actually done more technical caving than either Nora or Celia. He'd taken a course a few years before and had worked through a couple of more demanding systems with a club out of Roanoke. Of the 4 of us, he was the most technically prepared, which is why his being the most experienced in the group was worth noting. It wasn't inexperience that put him in that squeeze for 11 minutes. Whatever happened to him, there was not the product of a beginner's anxiety. We went in on a Saturday in mid-October, early enough in the morning that the air outside was still cold and the transition into cave temperature felt less dramatic than it does in summer. The entrance series was fine, everyone moved through it comfortably. The novelty of the cave working on Celia and Marcus the way it works on people who haven't spent much time underground, that mixture of focused attention and something close to wonder that I find pleasant to witness. We made good progress through the primary passage, stopping occasionally to let people examine formations or adjust their gear, moving at the pace of the group rather than any individual. I was first into the squeeze. This was the arrangement we'd discussed before entry. I'd go first, get established on the far side, and talk the others through from there, which is the standard approach when you have mixed experience levels. The squeeze at Flat Rock is a right side entry slot that requires you to turn your body about 45 degrees, lead with your right shoulder, and slide through with your lower arm extended and your upper arm close to your body. 8 feet of this, then a slight widening, then you're through. I went through it in under a minute, stood up on the far side, and called back. I heard Nora's voice from the near side confirming they were ready. I heard Celia say something I didn't catch. I waited for Marcus, who was second in line. Nothing happened. I called his name, called it again. Nora called something from the near side that I couldn't fully hear. The acoustics of the squeeze created a kind of muffled quality to sound in both directions. I pressed up against the far end of the slot and called through it. No response. I could see, from my angle, the light from the group's headlamps on the near side, the glow of it shifting as they moved. I could not see Marcus. I could not hear Marcus. I checked my dive watch. I note the time at the entrance and at significant points in a cave trip the way I note landmarks. It's a habit that disciplines your sense of time, which is easy to lose underground. The time when I confirmed Marcus had not come through was marked in my head as the start of the interval. 4 minutes. Nora's voice from the near side, asking if Marcus had come through yet. I told her no. A brief silence. 6 minutes. I pressed back to the far end of the slot and called through again. The group's lights on the near side were stationary now. Celia's voice, closer to the slot, asking if everything was okay. I said I was waiting for Marcus. She said Marcus was right there. I said I hadn't seen him come through. She said he'd been in the slot for several minutes. I said I'd been watching the slot and nobody had come through. That conversation happened through 8 feet of rock while we were both genuinely confused and both looking at the same problem from different sides of it. 9 minutes. I considered going back through the squeeze from my side, which would have meant passing Marcus in the slot if he was actually in it, which would have been physically impossible, or which would have confirmed that he wasn't there, which would have meant something else entirely. I didn't go back through. I don't have a fully coherent reason for that decision. I just stood on my side of that slot and watched the opening and felt the particular quality of helplessness that comes from a situation where you can't identify the correct action. 11 minutes after I'd come through, I watched the seconds on the dive watch. Marcus's right shoulder appeared in the slot opening. He moved through in a normal, unimpeded way. No struggle, no sounds of difficulty. He just came through. He stood up on my side of the slot and looked at me. His color was normal. His breathing was regulated and quiet. His eyes were clear and focused. There was absolutely nothing in his physical presentation that suggested he'd been in distress or that anything unusual had happened. If I'd been watching him without the context of the 11 minutes in the conversation with Celia through the rock, I would have thought he'd just done a routine squeeze and come through without incident. I asked him what had taken so long. He looked at me with a slight furrowing of the brow, the expression of someone who has been told something they can't quite locate in their memory. He said he didn't know. Said the last thing he clearly remembered was getting his body positioned for the entry, the specific rotation and shoulder alignment, the moment just before you commit to the slide, and then he'd been in the middle of it, already halfway through, with no clear memory of the section between. I asked if he'd felt anything, any physical sensation, any disorientation. He said no, nothing like that. He said it was more like a gap in the recording, the way sometimes you drive a familiar route and realize you have no conscious memory of the last few miles because your attention was elsewhere. He said it didn't feel alarming. He said that was actually the part that felt wrong, that there was a gap in his memory of what should have been a fully present physical experience, and that the gap didn't come with the distress that ought to accompany it. We continued the trip. Marcus was quiet in the way of someone who is processing something internally rather than in the way of someone who is frightened or injured. He moved through the remaining passage competently, made appropriate decisions, responded when spoken to. He was present and functional, but whatever conversational energy he'd brought into the cave that morning was gone. On the drive home, I was in the back seat with Celia, Marcus, and Nora in front. Nora was driving. It was an hour before Marcus said anything unprompted, and when he did, he said it quietly, not directed at any of us specifically. He said that in the squeeze, he'd had the feeling of being looked at from a direction that had no source. He said he didn't know how to be more precise than that. A direction that wasn't any of the four walls or the ceiling or the floor, a direction that wasn't from outside him, but a direction that had been present and specific, and that had held him in its attention for however long he'd been in there. I've never had an experience in a cave that I would describe that way. I've had the standard range of underground experiences: disorientation, a minor incident with bad air, the very specific fear of a light failure at a bad moment. What Marcus described is not in my experiential library, and I've thought about it a lot since. The feeling of being observed from a direction without a source, the memory gap in a moment of total physical presence. 11 minutes that Celia watched from one side and I watched from the other, and in which nothing moved through the slot. Celia brought it up once, several months later, in a conversation that Marcus wasn't part of. She said that from her side, she'd been able to see Marcus positioned at the slot entry the whole time, in the same position, not moving, not speaking. She said he'd looked like someone who was asleep standing up. She said she'd spoken to him and gotten no response. And she'd reached out and touched his arm and gotten no response to that either. And she'd been about to grab him and pull him back when he'd simply started moving through on his own. I haven't shared that detail with Marcus. I've thought about whether he deserves to know it, and I keep deciding no, not yet. Not until I have something more useful to tell him alongside it. He hasn't been in a cave since that October. He hasn't offered an explanation, and I haven't asked for one. What I know is that whatever held him at the entry to that squeeze for 11 minutes, whatever he encountered in that gap in his memory, whatever was watching from a direction without a source, it was enough to end 18 years of interest in underground spaces in a person who doesn't end things easily. I still cave. I was back in the flat rock system in the spring. I went through the squeeze without incident. On the far side, I stood for a moment and tried to feel what Marcus had described. Tried to identify a direction without a source, a quality of observation that couldn't be traced to any physical origin. I felt nothing unusual. But I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to before I moved on, and I've thought about why since. I want to be careful about how I present this, because my professional credibility is attached to it in ways that make me cautious. I work for a regional conservation nonprofit, whose mission includes the documentation and protection of karst systems in the Virginia and North Carolina sections of the Blue Ridge, which means my job is to find caves, survey them, assess their ecological and archaeological significance, and produce reports that feed into protection efforts and land management decisions. I've been doing this for 8 years. I've documented 63 systems, some of them significant finds, some of them minor, all of them properly reported through the appropriate channels. My record is clean. My methodology is sound. People who know my work trust it. What I'm about to describe has not been filed in any official report, and I'm going to explain exactly why, and I'm going to trust you to understand that the decision to not file it was not casual or comfortable and is not something I've fully made peace with. The system was identified through a combination of topographic analysis and a tip from a landowner adjacent to a Forest Service parcel who'd noticed an airflow from a section of road cut on the fire road boundary. Airflow from a rock face in karst terrain is one of the indicators we follow up on, because airflow means a connected passage system, and connected passage systems mean caves. I followed up on the tip in late July, on a day when I had no other scheduled field work, driving the fire road alone with my standard documentation kit and a half-day's expectation. The entrance was in the road cut exactly where described a narrow oval in the limestone face, roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, partially obscured by a hawthorn that had rooted in the road cut debris. The airflow was real and measurable with the smoke tube I carry for that purpose. A gentle outward flow, indicating a larger connected system rather than a simple pocket. I marked the entrance coordinates, photographed it, noted the vegetation obscuring it, and went inside. The first 20 feet were a crawl that opened into a standing passage, which is a favorable configuration, the tight entrance keeping out casual visitors, while the interior offers more manageable working conditions. The passage was old limestone, the walls carrying the biological staining of a mature system, the floor a mix of breakdown material and cave sediment that had been accumulating for a long time. No evidence of recent human entry that I could detect in the first section, no boot prints in the sediment, no scuff marks on the breakdown, no light scatter from a headlamp against the formation surfaces. The first chamber opened at about 60 feet from the entrance, a room perhaps 15 feet across and 10 feet high, the ceiling showing a scalloped pattern from old water flow, the floor relatively flat and sandy in the center, bat guano in the far corner, which I noted as likely indicating a colony somewhere deeper in the system. The handprints were on the right wall at approximately chest height. I've seen pre-contact ochre markings in caves before. They're not common in the Virginia-North Carolina section of the Blue Ridge compared to some other regions of Appalachia, but they exist and are documented in the literature. And when you find them, the appropriate response is a specific and careful protocol. Photograph without touching, document the spatial context, note the condition of the pigment, flag for archaeological assessment. I know this protocol. I've followed it twice before on other systems, where I found what appeared to be pre-contact markings. I followed it here. I photographed the handprints from multiple angles, noting the flat palm application, the classic negative space method, where the hand is pressed against the wall and pigment is applied around it, and the arrangement in a loose horizontal band, at a consistent height. The ochre was faded, the color degraded from what would have been a vivid red-orange to a duller rust-brown. The edges of the prints, indistinct in the way of marks that have been exposed to cave humidity for an extended period. I noted the condition in my field book as consistent with substantial age, meaning years to centuries rather than recent. I completed my documentation of the first chamber and moved on. The passage continued. I moved through it with my survey equipment, taking compass bearings and tape measurements, building the sketch that would form the basis of the map. Two smaller chambers connected by a short crawl. The system was developing into something more significant than a simple pocket, which was encouraging from a documentation standpoint. The handprints were in the second chamber. Same height, same flat palm application, same horizontal band arrangement. The ochre here was lighter in color than in the first chamber, not darker. Lighter, which I noted with a slight puzzlement because light typically indicated greater age, not less. The cave conditions were similar between the two chambers, so differential preservation should have produced similar pigment degradation. I photographed and moved on. The third chamber was the largest I'd reached, perhaps 25 feet in its longest dimension, the ceiling vaulted. Several small formations on the far wall showing the system had periods of active water flow that had produced calcite deposition. And handprints again, same height, same method, but the ochre here was noticeably different. Brighter, more saturated. The rust brown of the first chamber had shifted towards something closer to the original red-orange I'd expect from fresh ochre application. I stopped in front of this grouping for longer than I'd stopped at the previous ones. The progression I was documenting was wrong. In any scenario where these marks were made at one time by one group, the degradation should be uniform throughout the system, accounting for minor variations in local humidity and airflow. What I was seeing was the opposite of uniform degradation. The marks were getting fresher as I went deeper, as if someone had started at the back of the system and worked toward the entrance. Or as if the marks closest to the entrance were the oldest and the marks deeper in the system were more recent. I continued into the fourth chamber on the survey line I was carrying, following the handprints. Fourth chamber. Smaller, tighter, the ceiling lower. Handprints along the right wall. Consistent position, consistent method. The ochre bright enough now that I found myself moving my light closer to confirm what I was seeing. I put my gloved finger against the wall beside one of the prints, not on it, beside it, and pressed lightly and lifted my finger. The faintest trace of ochre transferred to my glove. I looked at my gloved finger for a long time. Fresh ochre in a cave environment is tacky in a specific way. The binding medium that holds the pigment to the rock surface remains workable for a period before it fully cures and desiccates. What was on my glove was a trace consistent with ochre that had not yet fully cured. Not hours old, days perhaps, or at most a week or two. Applied recently enough that the drying process was still underway in the stable humidity of the cave environment. Someone had been in this chamber within the past 2 weeks and had applied ochre handprints to the wall, using the same method, the same approximate height, the same arrangement as the prints I'd been documenting from the entrance. Someone was continuing a practice that the prints in the first chamber suggested was very, very old. I was at 240 feet of survey line. I had perhaps an hour of working time left in the daylight, accounting for the exit. I pointed my light down the passage ahead and saw what I'd been seeing in the previous chambers. The passage continued into the dark. I could not see the end of it. The handprints continued along the right wall into the dark beyond my light's reach. I made the decision to turn back. I've thought about that decision many times since, and I believe it was correct, though I can't give you a single clean reason. Part of it was the practical reality of the remaining survey line and daylight. Part of it was the professional assessment that I'd reached a point where what I was documenting exceeded the scope of a solo preliminary survey and required a different approach, a team, a proper archaeological consultation, decisions about how to handle what was clearly an active site rather than a purely historical one. And part of it, if I'm being fully honest, was the tacky ochre on my glove and the passage continuing into the dark with the prints along the right wall at chest height and the specific quality of the situation, which was that I had followed a continuous trail of handprints from a cave entrance 240 feet into a mountain, and the trail was getting fresher as I went, and someone was at the other end of it. I came out into the July afternoon and drove down the fire road and sat in my truck for a while. I've been back to the entrance twice since. Both times I've stood at the opening and looked in and not entered. My file documentation of this system consists of entrance coordinates, a brief passage description, and a note indicating preliminary survey incomplete. The handprints are not in any official record. I've told myself I'm waiting for the right moment to handle this properly, the right team, the right approach, the right consultation with the archaeological community about how to document an active ochre practice without disrupting it or exposing it to risk. That reasoning is legitimate, and I believe it. But I also know that 2 years have passed, and I haven't taken the steps to assemble that team or initiate those consultations. And when I'm honest with myself about why, the answer has something to do with the passage continuing into the dark, and the prints along the wall, and what's at the other end of a trail that someone has been maintaining from the inside. The ochre in the first chamber was made by someone long before I was born. The ochre in the fourth chamber was made by someone who was in that cave while I was alive and moving through its surface landscape, going about my ordinary days. The same practice continued across an interval I can't measure, in a system that nobody in the documented caving literature had entered before I did. Whoever is continuing it was in that system 2 weeks before I was. They may have been in it 2 weeks after. I don't know where the passage ends. I don't know what the last handprint looks like. I'm not sure I want to. I've been trying to write this down for almost 2 years, and every time I start, I end up stopping at the same place, which is the moment I came through the entrance crawl on my hands and knees and put my hand out expecting to feel open air and felt rock instead. That moment is where the story becomes something I can't fully make rational, and rationality is how I approach caving, how I approach most things, and losing it even in the retelling produces a feeling I'm not entirely comfortable with. But I've decided that keeping this to myself has not made it smaller, so I'm going to write it down completely and let it be what it is. Groundhog Mountain is a section of the Blue Ridge that I've worked since I started caving seriously about 12 years ago. The karst in that area is well developed, the limestone old and heavily dissolved, and there are documented systems throughout the ridgeline and the coves below it. I'd found the system I'm going to describe 2 years before this incident, on a different trip, entering from an opening about 300 feet south of the one I'm going to describe. That first entry had given me a general sense of the system's architecture, a primary passage running roughly north-south, with several side passages branching off it. The floor, a mix of breakdown and mud, the ceiling variable, generally navigable. I'd explored about a third of it on that first trip, and had planned to come back for a more thorough survey. The second entry was the one I'm describing. I'd found the northern entrance opening during a surface inspection of the outcrop line, an oval in the limestone face, roughly 2 feet wide and 4 feet tall, the lower edge at ground level with a rhododendron that had rooted in the soil accumulated at the base of the outcrop and grown across the lower portion of the opening. I pushed the rhododendron aside. It bent easily. The stems flexible and noted the opening's position and relationship to the surface landmarks around it and went inside. The entrance crawl was about 12 feet of hands and knees passage before the ceiling lifted enough to stand. I noted several specific things on the way in, as I always do, because the return route requires you to recognize what you came through. A flat breakdown slab with a distinctive curved crack across its surface near the entrance end of the crawl. A section of the right wall with a small flowstone boss at approximately waist height. A short section of lower ceiling, about 20 feet in from the entrance that required a brief duck. I note these things automatically. After 12 years, it's become the way my attention organizes itself in a cave. I spent approximately an hour inside. The primary passage connected to the one I'd explored on my first entry, about 150 feet in, which confirmed my mental map of the system. I pushed north along a passage I hadn't accessed before, found it terminating in a tight rift that I decided not to attempt without a partner, and turned back when my primary headlamp, a reliable unit that I've used for years, gave me the warning blink that indicates the battery is in its final 30%. Not an emergency, just a signal to be conservative and begin the exit. I retraced my route. This is important to establish clearly. I retraced the same passage I'd come in through. The dimensions were consistent with what I'd moved through on the way in. The mud floor showed my own boot prints at the intervals I'd expected. I can identify my own boot print by the specific wear pattern on the right heel, and I looked for it periodically as I came back. The flowstone boss on the right wall appeared at the distance I expected. The flat slab with the curved crack appeared when it should have. I went down to hands and knees for the lower ceiling section at the 20-foot mark. Everything was exactly as it should be. I hit the entrance crawl and went through it on my hands and knees, moving at a normal pace, watching the ceiling height in my headlamp beam as the passage compressed to crawl dimensions. I was expecting to feel the change in air quality that comes when you're approaching an entrance, a slight freshening, a shift in humidity, sometimes a detectable air movement if there's any outside wind. I didn't register any of these, which I noted without giving it significant weight because sometimes exterior conditions don't produce detectable air movement at cave entrances. I came to the end of the crawl and put my right hand forward to find the ground outside, the specific gesture of someone coming out of a cave entrance crawl, and my hand found rock. I stopped moving. I held my headlamp as steady as I could and looked at what was in front of me. A limestone wall, approximately 2 feet from my face, running the full width of the passage. The passage I was in terminated in this wall. The wall was not the exterior of the cave. It was the interior surface of the mountain, the same limestone I'd been surrounded by for the past hour, the same surface texture, the same color and moisture pattern. It was a wall where the entrance should have been, where the entrance had been when I'd come in. I backed up. Not in panic in the careful, controlled way you back out of a passage when you need to reassess. I backed up until I had enough room to sit up, and I sat, and I looked at my surroundings with the attention of someone who has just encountered a serious discrepancy between their mental model and reality. The passage around me was correct. I want to be clear about this because it's the detail that has most consistently resisted explanation in the 2 years since. The passage around me was recognizably the passage I'd come through. The formations, the floor profile, the ceiling height transitions, all of it was consistent with what I'd navigated both on the way in and on the way back. The passage was right. The entrance was not at the end of it. I went back to the flat slab with the curved crack, which I'd passed maybe 30 feet before reaching the wall, and I oriented myself. I was where I should be. I was in the entrance series. The entrance was not where it should be. I spent some time with the rational candidates. A second wall I'd passed through without noticing on the way in, not possible. The entrance crawl was the only section of that length and profile in the series. A formation that had been below my attention on the way in, and that I was now seeing as a wall. I examined the surface carefully, and it was solid limestone, not a flowstone deposit that could be misread. A wrong turn I'd made somewhere in the primary passage. I went back through my mental map and couldn't place one, and the boot prints in the mud were mine, going both directions, and they led directly to the wall. Then I turned my headlamp to the left and saw the perpendicular passage. It was in the left wall of the entrance series, roughly at the point where I'd expected to find the entrance. A passage-sized opening, running left at approximately a 90-degree angle from the direction I'd been traveling. I had not noticed this opening on the way in. I was completely certain I had not noticed it, because an opening that size in a passage that size is not a thing you don't notice. It would have registered. It would have been in my mental map. It was not. It was there now. I've thought Mew Ridge only appear when they need to. Pure Mr. Skell. Any times about what I did next, and whether it was correct, I went into the perpendicular passage. My reasoning was that it ran toward the surface. I could detect a faint air movement in it that I hadn't been able to detect in the entrance series, which suggested a connection to the exterior somewhere along its length. I followed it for approximately 40 feet before it tightened significantly, narrowed to a vertical rift, perhaps 14 inches wide, and opened into what I could see was exterior light from above. I removed my pack, pushed it through ahead of me, and negotiated the rift with some difficulty. It deposited me on the surface of the hillside, standing in October afternoon light, approximately 200 feet from where the original entrance was located. I could see the outcrop line from where I was standing. I could not see the rhododendron from that distance, but I knew the location. I stood on that hillside for a while and let my breathing normalize, and thought about what had just happened. I went to the original entrance. The oval opening was there, the rhododendron bending across the lower portion, The same position, the same relationship to the surface landmarks. It was exactly as I'd left it. I pushed the rhododendron aside and looked in, and saw the entrance crawl exactly as I'd entered it. I did not go back inside. I went back the following weekend with better equipment and a partner. I'd told him I wanted to resurvey the entrance series, which was true as far as it went. We went in through the original entrance, through the entrance crawl, through the series. At the point where the perpendicular passage had been, the left wall was solid, no opening, no passage, limestone. We went to where I'd encountered the terminal wall, and found instead the small breakdown room I'd passed through going in without noting it consciously, which connected to the rhododendron opening in the surface. The passage I'd come out through was not in that survey. The rift I'd emerged from was not visible from the surface when we looked for it. The hillside where I'd stood after coming out was correct. I recognized the view, but there was no rift in the rock face there. I've surveyed that entrance series 4 times since. The perpendicular passage has not appeared again. The terminal wall has not appeared again. I come out the way I go in, through the rhododendron, every time. I've thought about what happened in the way that you think about something that doesn't resolve returning to it, examining the available explanations, setting them down when they don't fit. The most honest thing I can say is that the cave let me in on one occasion, and then briefly declined to let me out the same way, and offered an alternative that was more difficult, but functional. And when I came back, it had returned to its normal configuration and has maintained it since. I don't have a mechanism for that. I don't have a category for it. I have the memory of a rock wall where open air should have been, and a passage that wasn't there going in and wasn't there after, and a way out that deposited me on a hillside 200 feet from where I needed to be. The cave is still in my survey files. I've listed the entrance series as fully documented, which it is. I've listed the perpendicular passage as unconfirmed. Ruth and I have been caving together for 7 years, and in that time we've developed the kind of partnership that forms between people who've been in tight spaces together, who've managed equipment failures and route-finding problems, and the specific interpersonal pressure of being underground for hours, with no option to take a break from each other's company. We don't need to talk much in the field. We read each other's caving. When one of us slows down, the other adjusts without discussion, and when one of us wants to push farther, the other reads that too. It's efficient and it's comfortable, and it's the product of shared experience in conditions where communication that requires words is a luxury. Dion was not our caving partner. Dion was a friend of Ruth's from her work life, a structural engineer who'd expressed serious interest in learning to cave over the course of several conversations that Ruth relayed to me over a period of months. He'd done his research, he'd read the right introductory material, he'd taken a beginner's safety course, he had appropriate equipment that he'd purchased himself rather than borrowing, and he'd been honest with us about his experience level, which was basically none beyond that course. He was the right kind of beginner, prepared, realistic, aware that he didn't know what he didn't know. We'd agreed to introduce him to a moderately technical system near the North Carolina line that Ruth and I knew well enough to move through confidently while still managing a newer caver. The cave is documented. Multiple expeditions by multiple groups over several decades, a solid survey on file with the regional society, known passages with known characteristics, and no significant history of surprises. I won't give the precise location here for reasons that will become clearer, but it's a legitimate system that's been used for introductory trips by multiple groups over the years. I've been in it perhaps 15 times. I know it, the way you know a route you've covered enough times that the landmarks appear slightly before you need them, confirming your position without requiring active search. We went in on a Saturday in early November. The timing was deliberate. November reduces the likelihood of other groups in the same system and gives the introductory experience a more solitary quality, which I prefer for first-time cavers because the presence of other groups can create a false sense of safety and also introduces variables that complicate the teaching dynamic. We signed in at the surface, marked the entrance, and went in at 10 in the morning. The first hour was everything a first caving experience should be. Dion moved carefully and asked good questions, and demonstrated the specific kind of physical intelligence that makes people effective in caves. He figured out his body's relationship to the passage constraints quickly, learned to read ceiling height changes before they required awkward adjustments, and didn't burn energy fighting the cave. Ruth and I had both noted this approvingly in a look we exchanged in the second chamber. He was going to be a good caver if he pursued it. We reached the end of our planned route by early afternoon and turned back. The return route was the reverse of the entry, which in this system meant retracing through 3 linked chambers and a connecting traverse before reaching the section with the free climb. The free climb is the most technically demanding part of the route, a 12-foot step up over a flowstone formation that bulges out from the wall, requiring you to find the correct sequence of handholds and footholds on the flowstone surface and commit to it. I'd coached Dion on what to expect before we reached it. I went first, moved up the flowstone with the familiar sequence I've used 15 times, stepped over the lip at the top and turned to help. Ruth came up next, taking my extended hand for the last 2 feet where the holds get marginal, and settled on the ledge beside me. We both turned and reached down for Dion. He was at the base of the flowstone, positioned to climb, but he wasn't moving. He was standing absolutely still with his head turned to look back down the passage behind him, the passage we'd come through, the lower section of the return route that extended back into the cave. I called his name. He turned to look up at us, and his face was different from the face he'd had for the previous 3 hours. I've spent time trying to describe this accurately because it was the first indicator, and I want to be precise about what I mean when I say his face was wrong. He was not injured. He was not in physical distress. His color was normal, his breathing visible and regular. What was wrong was his expression, which was the expression of someone who is exerting significant control over their reactions. The specific, focused quality of a face that has received information it's working to process without losing composure. I've seen that expression on experienced cavers in situations that warranted it. I'd never seen it on someone in the middle of their first caving trip on a routine return route. He climbed. He put his hands on the flowstone and moved up efficiently, took my hand for the last section, and came over the lip. He didn't say anything. We moved through the remaining passage to the entrance, through the entrance crawl, and out into the gray November afternoon, without any of us saying much. I was waiting for him to speak. He was doing something internal that I didn't want to interrupt. We were standing in the entrance area, packs on the ground, the cave mouth behind us, the hillside and the access trail and the parking area ahead, when he spoke. He said that on the climb, while he was positioned at the base of the flowstone with Ruth and me already above him, he'd heard something in the lower passage. He said it had been coming from behind him, from the direction we'd come from the passage that extended back into the cave below the climb step. He was precise about this. He hadn't heard something ambiguous or distant. He'd heard something close and moving, getting closer as he stood there. He described the sound as defying his available categories. Not a footstep, though it had a periodic quality that suggested movement from one point to another. Not a vocalization, though it had a quality that wasn't purely mechanical. Something between those two things, he said. And he said this with the frustration of someone who is used to describing structural problems in precise technical language and is encountering the limits of that precision. Repeated, irregular in its intervals, and getting closer as he stood at the base of the climb with Ruth and me 10 feet above him and the passage extending into the dark behind him. Ruth and I had been above the step, above the flowstone formation that created the acoustic discontinuity between the lower and upper passage sections. Ruth confirmed, when I looked at her, that she'd heard nothing unusual on the climb. Neither had I. The acoustic separation was real, the flowstone formation, and the step created a physical break in the passage that would affect sound transmission. Dion had been below that break, alone, for the time it took him to position himself and gather himself for the climb. However long that was, whatever was making that sound had been in the passage with him for that duration and had been getting closer. We drove back mostly in quiet. The debrief conversation that Ruth and I usually have after a trip with a new caver, processing what worked, what to work on next time, whether they want to come back, didn't happen in the way it usually does. Dion was present and coherent, and said appropriate things when we spoke to him, but he was working through something that didn't want to be interrupted by social performance. 14 days later, I got a text from him. A single question. Had either of us noticed anything in the parking lot when we came out? I texted back asking what he meant. He replied that in his memory of the parking lot, the walk from the cave entrance down the access trail to where we'd parked, He could clearly see something at the tree line on the far side of the lot that hadn't been there when we'd arrived that morning. He said his memory of it was specific and clear and had only surfaced a few days after the trip, the way certain memories surface when whatever was suppressing them relaxes. He said he'd been debating whether to mention it. I asked him to describe what he'd seen. He said he'd rather not. Said he'd rather not put language to it because he thought language might make it more concrete than he wanted it to be right now. He said he was still caving. He'd gone back to the basics course for a refresher and was planning to do some easier systems with the club he'd joined. He said he didn't want this to be the thing that defined his relationship with caving. He said he thought if he described it, it would become that thing. I told him I understood. I haven't pushed him on it since. Ruth and I have been back to that cave twice. Both times on the return route, at the free climb section, I found myself pausing at the base before I committed to the sequence. Not hesitating from any technical uncertainty, I know that climb in the dark if necessary. Pausing to listen to the lower passage behind me. Both times I heard nothing. Both times I climbed anyway, quickly, with the specific physical motivation of someone who doesn't want to be the last one below the step. I've thought about what Dion heard in the lower passage. I've thought about the sound he described, the thing between a footstep and a vocalization, periodic but irregular, getting closer. I've run through the fauna of that cave system, the documented inhabitants, the bats and the cave crickets, and the occasional surface animal that finds its way in. None of them produce a sound that matches what Dion described, and I've spent enough time in that system to know its sound profile fairly well. What I keep returning to is the timing. Whatever Dion heard was moving toward him while he was at the base of the climb, below the acoustic break, while Ruth and I were above it. And his memory of the parking lot, the thing at the tree line that hadn't been there in the morning, puts whatever it was on the surface with us, which means it followed us out, which means it knows how to navigate the cave from wherever it was in the lower passage to the entrance, and it knows what an entrance is for. I haven't told Dion this reasoning. I don't think it would help him. I don't think it would help me to have told him. What I know is that something was in the lower passage moving toward the last person in our group. And that same trip, something was at the tree line of the parking lot that hadn't been there in the morning. And the only thing connecting those two data points is a trail from the cave entrance to the parking area that the three of us walked together in the November afternoon. Dion was behind us on that walk. He saw what was at the tree line. He's decided not to describe it. I've decided not to ask again. I want to start with the lights, because the lights are the part that has the most available explanations, and I want to dispose of those explanations honestly before I get to the part that doesn't have any. 3 light sources. This is standard practice for anyone doing serious solo work in wild caves, and I've followed it without exception for 11 years. Primary headlamp is a high-quality unit with a regulated output that I replace batteries in before every trip, regardless of prior use. Surveying a cave is an act of translation. You're taking a 3-dimensional space that exists in total darkness and converting it into a 2-dimensional record that can be read, shared, and built upon by people who may never enter the original space. The tools are simple: a compass, a clinometer for vertical angles, a tape measure, a notebook, and pencil in a waterproof housing. And the method is methodical. You establish survey stations, measure the distance and angle between them, note the passage dimensions at each station, and sketch the walls and ceiling profile. Done carefully over multiple trips, the accumulated data builds into a map that represents the cave with a fidelity that approaches the real thing. I've been doing this for 11 years, the last 3 of them focused primarily on the Rooster Branch system in the Virginia section of the Blue Ridge, a complex multi-level cave with enough undocumented passage to justify sustained attention. I know my methodology. My instruments are calibrated. I check my data in the field, and I check it again when I'm transcribing. In 11 years, I've made errors, everyone does, but they've been the ordinary errors of imperfect measurement in difficult conditions, and they've been identifiable as such when I've gone back to check them. Compass drift, misread tape lengths, sketched wall profiles that were optimistic about the space. These are known failure modes with known signatures. What appeared in the composite map of Rooster Branch last spring does not have the signature of any failure mode I know. The composite was the product of 4 separate trips across 3 years, covering the entrance series, the main gallery, the 2 significant side passages, and the breakdown room at the system's currently explored back end. Each trip had produced field notes, sketched passage profiles, and a set of survey stations with measured connections between them. Compiling these into a single coherent map is the work of an evening at a large table with scaled paper, a drafting compass, and a protractor translating the angular and distance data into plotted positions, then connecting them with passage walls drawn from the field sketches. I was 3 hours into this compilation when the room appeared. It appeared the way mathematical implications appear, not as a thing directly stated, but as a consequence of other things that are stated. The survey data from my second trip, taken in the main gallery's northern extension, and the data from my fourth trip, taken in the upper-level passage that ran roughly parallel to the main gallery at about 30 feet of elevation above it, when plotted on the same scaled sheet with accurate angles and distances, produced a gap between them, a space defined by the surrounding surveys on multiple sides, the size and shape of which I could estimate from the geometry of the passages that framed it. Roughly oval, approximately 30 feet at its longest dimension, perhaps 20 feet wide. The surveys on the main gallery side approached it to within what the data suggested was about 8 feet. The surveys on the upper level side came within perhaps 15 feet. The space between those closest approaches, triangulated from multiple survey stations in both passages, was consistent and implied the same volume from every angle I calculated it from. I had no notes for this space, no station in it, no sketch of its walls, no record of having entered it on any of the 4 trips that produced the surrounding data. I went through my field notes from every trip. I checked my station logs, which record every survey station established with its location description and the conditions at the time of establishment. I looked for any note that might indicate I'd glanced into a passage leading toward where the room should be, any sketch element that suggested an opening in the gallery wall in the relevant section. Nothing. I had moved through both the main gallery and the upper-level passage without noting any passage connecting them in the area where the room should be. This was puzzling, but not alarming at that stage. Missed passages are not uncommon in complex systems. A tight crack at floor level in a section you're moving through quickly, a drape formation obscuring an opening, a passage entrance that's in your blind spot at the moment you pass it. The composite had identified a gap in my surveys that I simply hadn't noticed in the field. The logical next step was to go back with the composite in hand and look specifically for the connection. I went back on a Thursday in April, alone, with a printed copy of the composite marked with the approximate location of the unrecorded room and my standard survey kit. I knew the main gallery well enough to navigate it without survey stakes. I moved to the section of the gallery where the composite suggested the room was closest, the northern extension, past the third survey station cluster, where the passage makes a slight westward bend before straightening again. I worked the section carefully, both walls, floor level to ceiling, moving at pace that let me examine every square foot of surface. The left wall in that section is a mix of old breakdown that's been in place long enough to develop secondary flowstone, solid and immovable and continuous. The right wall is more variable sections of exposed limestone bedding plane, alternating with areas of breakdown, and I gave it particular attention because a connecting passage was more likely to be in the less uniform surface. I found no opening, no crack of passage width, no section of the wall that showed the airflow-induced moisture patterns that typically appear around passage entrances. The wall in that section was continuous and showed no evidence of ever having contained an opening. I moved my light along it at multiple angles, looking for the shallow depression that sometimes indicates a former passage that has been filled or collapsed. Nothing. I climbed to the upper level and examined the floor of the passage there in the corresponding section. Same result. The floor was intact limestone, old, with no break or depression that might indicate a passage below. I spent 3 hours in the system that day, re-examining every surface in the relevant sections from every angle I could manage. The room that my data implied was not accessible from any passage I could find, or that the existing surveys showed. The walls that should have contained connections to it were solid and undisturbed in the way of walls that have been solid and undisturbed for a very long time. I went home with the composite unchanged and the field notes from that fourth trip showing only negative results. No passage found at the indicated location. I sat with both at my drafting table and rechecked the geometry for the third time. The implication of the room was not a calculation error. I had a colleague who does precision drafting review my work. Without telling him what I was looking for, he confirmed the geometry. He asked me what the space was. I told him I was still working on that. There are things in the earth that exist without being accessible. Voids in the limestone that formed in one geologic epoch and were sealed in another. Chambers that the water table rose and fell through and left behind when it receded. Spaces that no surface has connected to in human time. Cave surveying occasionally implies these spaces, the way my composite implied this one, by mapping around them closely enough that their absence from the surveys becomes its own kind of presence. This is the explanation I've been working with for the past year. It's geologically sound, and it fits the facts as far as it goes. Where it stops fitting is the scale. The space implied by my data is 30 feet at its longest dimension. That's not a void, that's a room. A substantial room, larger than many of the documented chambers in the system, sitting 8 feet from a passage I've moved through on multiple occasions and 15 feet from another passage I've also surveyed. If a void that size existed in that section of the system, the hydrology should show evidence of it. The drainage patterns in the main gallery should reflect the presence of a large chamber nearby. I've looked at the hydrology notes from all 4 trips, and I can't find that evidence, which leaves me with a room that the geometry says is there and that I can't find a way into and that the geology doesn't obviously account for. I've been back twice since the April trip. Both times I've stood in the northern extension of the main gallery, at the section of the right wall where the room should be closest, and I've put my hand flat on the limestone and tried to feel what's on the other side. Cave walls transmit sound and vibration in specific ways. You can sometimes feel airflow through a crack, too small to see, or detect the different resonance of a wall that's backed by open space versus solid rock. Both times the wall has felt like wall, solid, backed by rock. And both times, standing there with my hand flat against the limestone in the dark, I've had the specific and non-rational experience of something on the other side of that wall being aware of my hand. Not a sound, not a physical sensation beyond the cold of the rock. Something more like the quality a room acquires when it's occupied a presence that changes the character of the space without producing any detectable physical evidence. I've listed the room in my survey notes as unresolved. I've added a footnote to the composite indicating a potential void at the given coordinates. Geological origin, undetermined. Access not established. I've been more honest in a separate set of notes that I keep for myself, which I've labeled personal observations and which I don't share with the regional society. In those notes, I've written what I can't put in an official report, that the room is there, that something is in it, and that the wall between us is old and solid, and has apparently been that way for a very long time. I don't know if the wall was always there. I don't know if it will always remain. What I know is that the geometry doesn't lie, and the room exists, and the wall that keeps me out of it has been there long enough to carry the same weathering as everything around it. Long enough that whatever is on the other side has had a long time to adjust to the arrangement. Dinesde, in September, alone, with 4 hours of planned working time and my standard solo protocols in place. The trip was going well. The breakdown passage had been navigable, and I'd made it to a room beyond a substantial breakdown chamber, maybe 40 feet across, the ceiling high enough to stand in most of it. I was crossing the rubble floor toward a low passage in the far wall that I wanted to examine when the lights went out. All of them. At the same moment, not flicker, not fade off, the way a light goes when the switch moves from on to off in a single decisive motion. I stopped walking. In the dark, I stopped walking, and I stood still, and I held the position of my body very carefully, because I was in a breakdown room on a rubble floor, and moving without light in that environment is how you turn an ankle or put a foot through a gap between slabs and go down hard. I stood still, and I breathed, and I did what you do in that situation, which is take stock before you act. Cave dark is a thing that has to be experienced to be understood. I've described it to people and watched them nod and then describe what they're imagining, which is always the dark of a room with the lights off, the dark of a closet, the dark of a very overcast night outdoors. None of these are the thing. In all of those darks, photons are present reflecting off surfaces, traveling from distant sources, doing the work of light at a very low level. Your visual cortex can work with that. It cannot work with zero. Cave dark is zero. And in zero, your visual cortex starts making things up, generating the visual noise called phosphenes, bright-edged shapes and drifting patches that your brain produces not because there's something to see, but because it can't tolerate the absence. You learn to recognize this for what it is. You learn to not trust your eyes. You learn to navigate by other senses. I reached for the backup headlamp and found the switch and pressed it. Nothing. I reached for the torch on my chest rig and pressed its switch. Nothing. I stood in the dark and thought carefully, which is what you do when you have identified that the situation has become serious, and acting before thinking will make it more serious. I was 400 feet from the entrance, give or take. The route was the primary passage, straightforward, no significant junctions that could send me wrong. 400 feet of cave passage in total darkness, without light, navigable by touch if I could find the wall and follow it consistently. I've done shorter distances in darkness as training exercises. 400 feet was not impossible. It required patience, and it required not making any uncontrolled movements. I breathed. I took stock of my physical position, orienting my body toward the direction I'd come from, which I could reconstruct from my movement memory. I identified where the passage entrance to the breakdown room was relative to my position. I'd come through it maybe 30 feet behind me, and slightly to my left. Then something said my name. My full name, both given name and surname, in that order, correctly pronounced in the specific way it's correctly pronounced, which is not the way most people say it on first attempt. The pronunciation that you produce, if you know me, or if you've been told how to say it by someone who does. Conversationally, at the volume of someone speaking in a normal indoor register from about 10 feet away. From the direction of the far wall, the wall with the low passage I'd been moving toward when the lights went out, the direction where the passage continued deeper into the system, the direction I had not come from. I did not respond. This was not a calculated decision. I simply did not speak. I stood in the dark and did not make any sound and did not move and listened. The silence after my name was the same silence as before it. Total. No breathing that wasn't mine. No movement of any kind. Whatever had said my name said it once and then was part of the dark again. I began moving toward the passage entrance I'd come through, using the wall-following method. I moved laterally until my outstretched hand found a wall. Then I put both hands flat on the wall and began moving along it in the direction I believed led back toward the main passage. Cave walls are not smooth. They're irregular surfaces of limestone in various states of breakdown and formation, and following them by feel is slow and requires constant correction. I moved at the pace the conditions allowed, which was not fast. 26 minutes. I know, because my dive watch has a luminescent display that was the only light source available to me for that period, and I checked it when I found the main passage entrance, and again when I found the entrance crawl, and again when I came out into the September afternoon. 26 minutes of moving through the dark in a breakdown room, and then a known passage, following walls, moving at the deliberate pace of someone who cannot afford a fall. I did not hear my name again. I did not hear anything except the sounds I was making, my boots on breakdown rubble, my hands on the limestone, my breathing. I came out into the afternoon and sat down at the entrance for a while. Then I got up and walked to my car and opened the driver's door and sat in the seat and took out all 3 light sources and tested them in sequence. Primary headlamp, functioning normally at full output. Backup headlamp, functioning normally. Handheld torch, functioning normally. I sat in the car for a long time. There is one explanation for the voice that I've been unable to dismiss, and it's the one I resist the most because of what it implies about the other things that have happened in that cave. The explanation is that someone else was in the system, that another person, perhaps a caver I hadn't known about, perhaps someone who had come in through the same entrance after me, or through another entrance I hadn't identified, was in that breakdown room when my lights went out and called my name. This explanation requires someone who knew my name. It requires them to have been in the dark too, or to have killed their own light, which is why I hadn't seen them and to have remained still and silent after speaking, not responding to my movement through the room and through the passage, not appearing at the entrance. It requires a person who knew my name, was in the cave with me, called my name once in a conversational register, and then maintained complete silence and concealment while I navigated 26 minutes of dark to get out. I've gone back 4 times. I've found no evidence of another person using the system, no survey marks, no equipment traces, nothing. I've looked for secondary entrances and found none that would accommodate a person. The prior documentation of the system doesn't indicate any. My name is not on my gear. It's not marked on any of my equipment, not on my helmet, not on my pack. There is no document on my person when I go underground that would allow a stranger to know what I'm called. Someone in that cave knew my name and said it in the dark from the direction of the passage I hadn't yet explored, and then was silent while I found my way out, and I have not been able to explain any part of that in the 14 months since. I'm still working the survey. I've been back 6 times since that September, always with a partner now, always with the partnership explicitly covering the section of the breakdown room near the far wall passage. My partner knows something happened there. I've told her the lights failed simultaneously, and I navigated out in the dark. I haven't told her about the voice. I'm not entirely sure why. Something about saying it out loud in the context of the cave we're still working feels like an acknowledgement I'm not ready to make. What I've told myself is that I'm going to push the far wall passage eventually, that I'm going to find out where it goes and what's at the end of it. I've told myself this on each of the last 6 trips, and on each of them, when we've been in the breakdown room, I've found reasons to work other sections first. Reasons that seem legitimate in the moment and less legitimate when I examine them afterward. Whatever is at the end of that passage knew my name in September. It knew it without introduction. It said it once, in the dark, and waited. I don't know what it's been doing since. I need to establish something about the nature of cave formations before I describe what I found, because the thing I found only becomes fully disturbing if you understand the science behind why it shouldn't exist. Speleothems, stalactites, stalagmites, columns, flowstone, all the calcite structures that people associate with caves form through a process that is geological in its pace. Water-carrying dissolved calcium carbonate drips through limestone, enters the cave environment, and deposits infinitesimal amounts of calcite as it evaporates or releases carbon dioxide. The rate of this deposition varies with conditions: water flow, temperature, mineral concentration, carbon dioxide levels in the cave air, but it is never fast. Conservative estimates put average growth rates in the range of 1/10 of an inch to 1/2 an inch per century, depending on conditions. The fastest growing speleothems in the most favorable conditions grow at perhaps 1 inch per century. These are the outliers. Most formations in most caves grow far more slowly, and the growth is so incremental that scientists use speleothems as climate records, reading the layered calcite the way you'd read rings in a cross-section tree, each layer representing a season, or a decade, or a century of changing conditions. A column 3 feet tall, a meter of calcite in a cave system with the hydrology of the Laurel Creek system, taking the most generous growth rate estimates and applying them consistently, would require a minimum of several hundred years to develop. At average growth rates, a millennium or more, at the conservative end of the range for that system's documented conditions, potentially several millennia. I have photographs showing clear floor where that column now stands, taken over the course of 4 years of visits. I want to be careful about how I'm framing this, because I recognize that it sounds like the setup for something that will eventually have a mundane explanation: misidentified photographs, a different section of the chamber, documentation error. I've audited every one of those possibilities with the same methodical attention I bring to my survey work, and I'm going to describe that audit process because I think it's important that you understand how thoroughly I've eliminated the available explanations before I ask you to sit with what remains. The Laurel Creek system is a mid-sized cave in a section of the Blue Ridge. I've worked for most of my documentation career. The formation chamber is the terminal room in the primary passage, accessed through a hands and knees crawl that opens suddenly into a space that genuinely takes your breath away the first time you see it. The formations are exceptional, the kind of density and variety that takes millions of years of the right conditions to produce, the kind you see in maybe a handful of cave systems in the entire region. I've photographed it extensively across my 4 visits, and my documentation of that chamber is among the most thorough I've produced for any single cave space. My first visit was 4 years before this incident. My second was 18 months later. My third was 2 years after that, and my fourth was the visit I'm describing, roughly 8 months after the third. 4 visits over 4 years, each producing a photographic record of the chamber's contents, each record accurately dated and stored in my documentation archive. On my 4th visit, I came through the entrance crawl and stood up in the chamber and knew immediately that something was different. Not in the way of something that requires study immediately. The way you know immediately when something has been moved in a room you know well. The spatial geometry of the chamber had changed. There was a vertical element in the center of the formation area that had not been there before. The column was approximately 3 feet tall, and at its widest, perhaps 12 inches in diameter. It stood in the open floor area between 2 clusters of stalagmites, in a position that my prior photographs showed as clear passage. It was a proper column, a formation that forms when a stalactite and a stalagmite grow toward each other and eventually meet and fuse, creating a continuous calcite structure from floor to ceiling. Except there was no stalactite above it, which is geologically anomalous. The column rose from the floor and terminated at about 3 feet, without connecting to the ceiling above. The calcite was pale, not the bright white of active formations currently receiving water flow, but the off-white of formations that have dried and stabilized, the color of old bone. The surface showed the layered texture that develops over long periods, the fine horizontal banding that you see in formations old enough to have accumulated visible growth rings. When I moved my light across the surface at a low angle, the texture was unmistakably that of something that had been growing for a very long time. I photographed it from every angle before I did anything else, which is protocol, and which is also what I would have done regardless of protocol, because I was already processing the dissonance, and I knew I'd need the record. I worked methodically around the column, documenting the base where it met the cave floor, the surface texture at multiple heights, the upper terminus, the relationship between it and the surrounding formations. Then I photographed the surrounding chamber from the positions I'd used in prior visits to give myself the clearest possible comparison. I went home and opened my archive. The prior photographs were exactly as I remembered them. I found images from all 3 previous visits, showing the relevant area of the formation chamber. On every prior photograph, the floor between the stalagmite clusters was clear. Open space, photographed in the course of thorough documentation, showing no formation in the position where the column now stood. I aligned the new photographs with the old ones using the surrounding formations as reference points and confirmed that I was looking at the same section of the chamber. The reference points matched. The floor was clear in the prior images and occupied in the new ones. I sent the complete documentation, old and new photographs, visit dates, GPS coordinates, to a geologist colleague named Priya who studies speleothem formation systems in the region. I didn't tell her what I was looking for. I told her I was doing a comparative documentation of a formation chamber and asked for her assessment of a particular formation's age and growth characteristics. I indicated the column in the new photographs with a circled annotation. She came back to me within a few days. She said the formation showed characteristics consistent with several hundred years of growth at minimum, more likely in the range of 500 to 1,000 years, based on the surface texture and apparent calcite density visible in the photographs. She noted the absence of a corresponding stalactite and said that was unusual but not unheard of in chambers where ceiling drip patterns shift over time. She asked where the system was located. I told her. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said that given what she knew about the hydrology and the calcite saturation levels in that part of the Laurel Creek drainage, the growth rate for that chamber would be at the slow end of the regional range. She said that a formation of those apparent characteristics in that system would represent a growth period on the longer end of her estimate, not the shorter. She said that was her assessment of the photographs. Then she asked me the question she'd apparently been sitting on since I'd told her the location. She asked whether I was certain the formation had not been present on my prior visits. I told her I had prior photographs documenting its absence. She was quiet for longer this time. Then she said that what I was describing was not possible within any geological framework she was aware of. She said she'd like to see the original photographs. I sent them. She looked at them and came back to me 3 days later and said she had no explanation to offer. She said the word carefully, in the specific way that scientists use it when they mean they've reached the limit of the framework rather than the limit of their personal knowledge. She said she'd be interested to examine the formation in person at some point. I went back once, about 3 months after the initial discovery, The column was still there. No change in the height, no change in the color, no change in the surface characteristics. The same formation, in the same position, looking as it had on my fourth visit. I photographed it again and updated my records. I ran my gloved hand along the surface, which I normally wouldn't do with a significant formation. The calcite was dry, not inactive in a temporary way, dry in the way of something that hasn't had active water flow in a very long time. The formation was not growing. Whatever process had created it had stopped. I've been trying to construct a scenario that accounts for these facts, and I found myself unable to complete it. The formation has the physical characteristics of something very old. My photographs document its absence from a location I visited and documented 4 times over 4 years. The geologist who assessed it on the basis of photographs concluded it was old in ways that conflict with the photographic record of its absence. The formation itself appears to have ceased active growth. What I keep arriving at, after going through every other possibility, is the question of where it was before. Not how it grew so quickly. The surface characteristics don't support rapid growth, and rapid growth in those conditions isn't achievable by any process I'm aware of. But where a formation with several centuries of growth history was located, before it appeared in the center of the formation chamber of a cave I've documented over 4 years. Formations don't move. That's the foundational geological fact at the bottom of this problem. Calcite doesn't relocate. A speleothem that developed over centuries developed in one place, and it stays there. Except that one apparently didn't, or arrived in that chamber from wherever it developed, or has always been there in some register that my photographs failed to capture, and my eyes failed to see until my 4th visit. The last option is the one I've spent the most time with, because it's the only one that doesn't require something impossible. That the formation was there on my prior visits, and I simply didn't see it. I've looked at my prior photographs many times. The floor is clear. My documentation is thorough. I've shown the prior photographs to 3 people who know formation chambers and asked them what they see in the indicated area without telling them what I'm looking for. All 3 describe the same thing: open floor. The column is still there. I have it in my records. It has not changed. It was either not there before and now is, or it was always there and became visible on my 4th visit and has remained visible since. I don't know which of those is more troubling. Carla and I have an agreement that I'm breaking by writing this, and I want to acknowledge that before I go further. The agreement was specific, and we made it consciously, and I've honored it for 2 years. What's changed is that I've come to understand that honoring it indefinitely requires a kind of ongoing suppression that's become its own problem. That the thing we heard in that cave has not diminished in my memory, the way difficult experiences usually do over time, and that the agreement which was made to protect us from a category of explanation we weren't ready for has instead preserved the experience with a fidelity I didn't anticipate. It's as clear now as it was on the Tuesday afternoon we came out of that system and drove in silence to the nearest town. Clearer, maybe. The kind of clear that comes from something you've been very carefully not examining for 2 years. I'm not going to tell Carla I'm writing this. That's a separate thing I'll have to deal with. Carla and I have been caving together for 9 years, which is long enough to have developed a partnership that functions without much communication. We read the cave the same way, make decisions on the same timeline, have the same relationship to risk, which is respectful rather than dismissive. We've been in systems that required genuine problem solving under pressure, a flood pulse in a passage we had to move through quickly, a navigation error in a complex system that added 2 hours to a long trip, the kind of equipment failure that happens in cave environments, and that you deal with methodically rather than emotionally. We've never had a serious incident. We've never had an experience underground that we couldn't account for afterward with available explanations. Until the Tuesday in September, 2 years ago. The landowner was a man named Garrett, who owned agricultural and timber land near the Virginia-North Carolina border, a family property that had been in his family for several generations. He'd contacted our regional caving society because he'd found an opening on his property and wanted to know what it was, and the society had passed the inquiry to me because I worked that section of the region. I'd visited the opening in the spring, confirmed it was a natural cave entrance leading into a substantial system, and arranged with Garrett to come back in September with Carla for a proper survey trip. Garrett knew we were going in. We'd signed his access form and discussed the trip with him the morning we arrived. He was a straightforward person, a farmer in his 60s with the specific practical quality of people who spend their lives working a piece of land and have no patience for the non-essential. He told us to take our time, told us where he'd be if we needed him, and left us to it. The entrance was in a limestone outcrop at the edge of a timber lot, partially screened by fallen timber that had come down in a wind event a few years prior. We cleared enough to get in comfortably, and went through the entrance on our hands and knees into a walking passage that opened almost immediately. The system was well-developed, mature formations in the first chamber, clear evidence of active hydrology in the passage structure, the kind of interior geometry that develops over a long time in favorable conditions. We settled into the survey rhythm and made good progress through the morning and into the afternoon. 4 hours of survey, covering the primary passage and 2 significant side passages, produced good data and a sketch map that represented probably 70% of the visible system. We turned back when we reached the end of our planned survey line, which is the protocol for a first trip in an undocumented system. You don't push beyond your planned limit on a first visit. You come back with information and a plan. The return route was the passage we'd come in through. We retraced it in the order of our survey stations, moving at a reasonable pace, the kind of pace you move at when the work is done and you're heading out of a familiar route. The passage for most of its length was comfortable walking cave, and we moved through it without incident. There is a section about 200 feet from the entrance where the passage tightens significantly, not a squeeze, nothing requiring special technique, but a constriction that requires you to turn sideways and move carefully for about 15 feet before the passage opens again. We'd gone through it on the way in without noting anything unusual. It was simply a tight section in a passage, the kind of thing that appears regularly in cave systems, and that experienced cavers navigate without thinking much about it. We were in that constricted section on the way out, Carla ahead of me by perhaps 10 feet, both of us moving at the careful sideways pace the width required when we both stopped. Not one after the other, the same moment. I know this because I was watching Carla's headlamp ahead of me, the specific quality of light movement that indicates a person walking versus standing still, and the light stopped moving at the same moment I stopped moving. We hadn't signaled. We hadn't communicated. We stopped because something caused us to stop, and it caused us both to stop simultaneously. I have spent 2 years trying to describe what I heard in that passage, knowing all along that I wasn't going to describe it to anyone, running it over in my mind anyway, in the way you work a sore tooth, not because it helps, but because the mind returns to unresolved things, regardless of your instructions to it. The best I can do is describe what it wasn't, and why what it wasn't matters. It was not water. I've heard every sound that water makes in caves, the drip, the trickle, the rush of active streams, the resonance of a pool, the sucking sound of a passage flooding from the bottom. None of those. It was not a bat. I've heard bats in caves in every context, roosting colonies, disturbed individuals, echolocation, distress. None of those. It was not a rock settling or a formation shifting. These sounds are recognizable, low and single and mechanical. Not that. It was not an echo of our own movement, which is a thing that happens in certain passage geometries, and that I've been fooled by exactly once in my caving career, which is why I know what it sounds like and how to identify it. Not that. What it was, and I'm going to say this with the precise discomfort I've been sitting with for 2 years, was language adjacent, not language. I want to be careful about that distinction because language implies specificity, implies words or the structure of words, and I'm not claiming that. What I heard had the quality of intentional sound production, of something making sounds with the specific purpose of conveying information to a listener. The rhythm of it was wrong for any animal I know. The cadence was wrong. The way it occupied the air in that passage was wrong in the way of a thing that understood what it was doing with sound in an enclosed space. It lasted perhaps 15 seconds. Then it stopped. We stood still for a moment after it stopped. Then we moved, without discussing it, at a pace that was faster than our pace had been before. We came out of the entrance into the September afternoon, and Garrett was visible across the field, doing something with machinery near the barn. We walked to our car. We loaded our gear. We drove to the nearest town, which was 20 minutes away on county roads, and we parked at a diner and went inside and sat in a booth. We sat with our coffee for a long time before either of us said anything. I went first because I needed to know if Carla had heard the same thing. I described it in the terms I've used here, not language, but intentional, rhythmic, cadenced, wrong. I watched her face while I described it, and her face had the specific quality of someone recognizing something they've been sitting with. She said that was what she'd heard. We talked for an hour. Not about what it was, we never arrived at what it was, and I don't think the conversation was aimed at that, not really. The conversation was about what to do with having heard it, which is a different problem. We arrived at the agreement over the course of that hour. We would not describe what we'd heard to anyone, not to the landowner, not to the caving society, not to partners or family, because describing it required accepting it as real, and accepting it as real required a category of explanation that didn't exist in the frameworks either of us worked in, and neither of us was prepared to step outside those frameworks in a diner on a Tuesday afternoon. I've thought about the agreement many times since. I understand the reasoning that produced it, and I still think the reasoning was sound given where we were when we made it. What I didn't anticipate was that the agreement would preserve rather than diminish. That keeping the thing unnamed and undiscussed would maintain it at full fidelity in my memory rather than letting it soften the way most difficult experiences soften with time. We haven't been back to the system. I haven't contacted Garrett about a follow-up trip, which I would normally have done by now. Carla hasn't asked about it. The survey we produced from that first trip is in my files, labeled as incomplete, which it is. I haven't told Carla I'm writing this. What I'm going to say at the end of this, because I need to say something, is this. What we heard in that passage was making itself understood to us. I don't know what it was saying. I don't know what it was. But the intentionality of it, the quality of something producing sounds with the specific purpose of being heard and interpreted, is not something I've been able to argue myself out of in 2 years of trying. Something in that cave system on Garrett's land was communicating. The question I've been sitting with, the one that surfaces at night when the house is quiet and my mind goes back to that tight passage and those 15 seconds of sound, is not what it was saying. The question I can't put down is simpler and worse. Whether it's been waiting for us to come back and say something in return, I've exploring,